Welcome to something else entirely, where we center the weird so we may grow stronger in spirit.
Hey everybody, welcome back. It's a beautiful day in Colorado. Hope it's a beautiful day wherever you are. I met with a student this morning who had just graduated and was headed off to begin his dream job. And he asked me, after everything I've been through in my life, off the record, what I thought about science now. He said, well, do you see it as a room in a hallway full of many rooms, or what do you think about science now? And it was a great question to lead into today's episode. I think the way I see science now is as a powerful tool, powerful lens on reality that has unfortunately often, or at least sometimes, been wielded by people who've lost their curiosity, who don't have humanity's best interests at heart, who are susceptible to scientism, which is what we'll be talking about today. So science and scientism are different things. Scientific method is a powerful tool we've developed to inquire about the nature of reality, to gather information. Scientism is a belief system that science is the only valid way. If you're a philosopher or a poet, forget it. You're not worth anything. And I believe scientism is questionable, and it's also the one that leaves me the most personally offended, because I spent majority of my 20s in graduate school at Northwestern University alone in a little dark microscope room, conducting single molecule biophysics experiments to determine how two different proteins in our immune system work together to detect RNA viruses. I was very good at this, in multiple publications, but my best one was published in Cell, which, for those of you who know, is a reputable journal. And so I loved science. I was committed to science. And to go back a little bit, I grew up in the church, and I lost my faith in organized religion when I went to college. And given some of the immense tragedies that organized religion has caused on this planet, I believe that was an okay thing to happen to me, for me to lose that faith. However, I immediately gave that blind faith over to science or scientism. And consequently, as we discussed last time, materialism and reductionism. So I was still a believer, but just now in science. And I dedicated my life to this. I worshiped at the altar of science for most of my formative years. And for those of you who don't really know how that process or institution works, there are principal investigators, researchers who work to get grant money. They have graduate students who do experiments to determine answers to hypotheses. So they do their experiments, they analyze the data, then they write this up in complex academic peer-reviewed journals that very few people can actually understand other than people who work very closely on the same kind of narrow piece of reality. And these journals that we're submitting to have editors, and they decide whether or not the papers are acceptable for publication. And the journals have varying degrees of reputational clout, and that clout leads to your boss getting more grant money. And so you're always trying to get published in the best journal that you can. This being said, many of these editors have deeply entrenched biases about what is an appropriate scientific question. So these biases are part of what I'm talking about here with scientism. Here's an example of this in action. So a paper was submitted which surveyed novice and advanced meditators who asking them how many of whom had encountered psi-type experiences. So psi, psychic, paranormal, supernormal, mystical, anomalous. And they weren't saying anything about the validity of their experiences, just asking over 1,000 meditators what they experienced. And they found that a large percentage of meditators did indeed report mystical or psi experiences, which they attributed to their practice. And so the researchers submitted this to a mainstream journal and it was rejected outright. Now, having played this game myself, quite successfully, I might add, having played this game myself, the fact that papers get rejected is normal. That happens all the time. However, the way this one was rejected is an example of scientism in action. The editor says, "Is it worth spending public research money and resources, as well as the scientist's time necessary for peer review, let alone misleading the public and media's attention to test the hypothesis that 1 + 1 = 3, or that pigs can fly, or that water can be turned to wine?" This is a pretty intense reaction for a paper that simply reports a survey of people's lived experiences. Nothing about the validity of those experiences. But the editor was so concerned that his readers might think his journal was sympathetic to the mystical, or that he was, that he ended his explanation with the following statement: "I will do everything in my power to avoid any public research grant money being spent in that direction." This is scientism. This is the gatekeeping of information, saying, no, this information can't be published. And if you think about it, it sort of makes sense, right? If we have some type of personal power that flows through us, or if these phenomena are real to some extent, who would want to pay for that research if we can't commodify it? Things like pharmaceuticals, other endeavors where perhaps there is money to be gained from understanding. But if we're just trying to understand the lived experience of people, who would want to pay for that if there's no money to be made from it? The story has a happy ending, which is that the paper did end up being published in 2018 in an open access peer-reviewed journal. I'll link to it in the show notes. Open access just means not behind a paywall. Many scientific journals exist behind a paywall, but this one is open to everyone. So we're going to check it out now. It's pretty fascinating. I do realize this was published in 2018, so I am a few years behind, but so it goes. I am here now, better late than never. Right, guys? Yeah. So in this paper, they ask 1,120 meditators about their lived experiences during meditation. And here is some of what they find. Altered breathing, 88% at least one time, 75% saying this happened many times or almost always. Now, altered breathing, you're meditating, that's maybe not particularly incredible or interesting, right? Yeah, of course. Now, sensations in the body that were not caused by the physical environment. 85% at least once, 73% saying many times or almost always. An altered sense of time, 86%. Increased synchronicities that they found meaningful, 82%, 65%, many times or almost always. Altered awareness, 91%. Aha moments, 89%. Now, this is where it gets a little weird. Clairvoyance and or telepathy was the most common extended perception experience. So clairvoyance meaning there are events that are known to you that could not possibly be known by other means that later become true. Telepathy, mind-to-mind communication. 56% report experiencing this at least once, while 30% of these meditators say, yes, I experience clairvoyance or telepathy many times or almost always. 30%. And now, for those of you who might say, well, that's just meditation, or who maybe are bored at this point because of the amount of percentages I've just said to you, let me tell you a story from a student. I listened to your podcast this morning and I wanted to tell you that it was so inspiring. I have always been someone who believes in spirits and the power of the universe. And it was really refreshing to hear someone that is in the academic world talk about these things. My friends never think it makes sense that I believe in these things with all the academia I participate in and learn to analyze. She reveals that she's in a scientific engineering major here. I won't say which, as I don't want to out her. But I now know it's okay to believe these things, even if they aren't socially acceptable. She goes on to say, I've had many moments in my life where these coincidences have happened. One more recently is when my mom and I were talking about my grandma, who recently passed, and suddenly her favorite book fell off the shelf. A few seconds later, in a different room, a small statue that she owned fell. We knew it was her, but everyone else wrote it off as the house shifting. But we knew. And so now that you've heard these percentages and you've heard this real life story from a real student of mine, let me ask you again what you think about those reviewer comments. Is it worth spending public research money and resources, as well as the scientist time necessary for peer review, let alone misleading the public and media's attention to test the hypothesis that 1 + 1 is 3 or pigs can fly? To me, this seems like a pretty harsh reaction to a paper that simply summarizes 1,000 people's lived experiences. And so this idea that even just publishing the summary of their lived experiences would somehow mislead the public and media's attention. And while we're on the subject, I'm not so sure what the public and the media are doing to direct our attention toward anything significant or meaningful that might inspire hope. In this case, I think leading the media and public's attention toward this would have been a great idea. Leading it to the lived experiences of some folks who are having some pretty interesting experiences, wouldn't you say? Clairvoyance, telepathy, precognition. So the problem I see here is not with science, but with scientism, and the fact that it has completely disregarded human beings' lived experience as invalid or not worthy of study. And there's kind of an irony here, because we say, okay, these mystical experiences aren't worthy of study, and yet we have so many scientific revelations that have come from these unexplainable lived experiences or altered states of consciousness. For example, the scientist who discovered the structure of benzene, so this is a ring molecule in chemistry, he was reportedly dozing by the fire when he saw a vision of a snake eating its own tail, spinning in a circle. Upon waking, he realized this symbolized a closed ring structure, which allowed him to discover the structure of benzene. And I want to share this quote, so beautiful, from him. Let us learn to dream. Then perhaps we shall find the truth. But let us beware of publishing our dreams before they have been put to the proof by the waking understanding. I think this so beautifully summarizes the problem. We're so obsessed with our waking understanding that we've forgotten to dream, and we need the synthesis of both. And now I want to talk about Newton and Leibniz. So these two fellas are generally credited with inventing calculus. Now, that's debated. I know that. But regardless, these are two people whose work we've glorified. Newton studied alchemy, mysticism, and prophecy, at least in as much time as he invested in the development of calculus. He believed in a prisca sapientia, an ancient wisdom passed down in symbols. Leibniz, also credited with the invention of calculus, was a metaphysical thinker who believed the universe was composed of points of consciousness that reflect the whole universe. That everything in the universe expresses a divine harmony, even pain and imperfection. And so these two human beings, Newton and Leibniz, who we credit with the invention of calculus, and now force our students to take Calc 1, Calc 2, and Calc 3, and yet I do not see mysticism 1, 2, and 3 as required by the academy. And I'm not going to get into how to attempt to fix higher education. That system works at a scale that the little avatar of Annie cannot begin to fix. But I do think it's worth questioning why we have completely abandoned half of these men's work. Stay with me. I want to go full circle back to last episode. You remember the story of the skeptic Schirmer, who in 2014, the grandfather's broken radio began playing on their wedding night, never to play again. In 2014, he says, "Yes, I believe." 2 years later, has forgotten, says, "No, not possible to measure these things. We must resist such efforts because they will never succeed." And so this amnesia just 2 years after the magical experience. And so where does this amnesia come from? Why does this happen? I believe it happens because we are up against 400 years of reductionism, materialism, and a modern version of scientism that says certain types of questions aren't allowed to be asked. And I also believe that this sort of magical amnesia happens because our media environment has left us in a constant state of distraction. And our imaginations have been colonized and taken over by gigantic tech companies who are trying to extract every last drop. Heaven forbid we quiet our mind and access information. No. See, there I go again. Can't stay off that rant. But I do think that that is contributing to the amnesia. And these isms are so deeply embedded in our worldview that often the only way to change the perspective of scientists is to flip them out of this way of thinking through direct mystical or paranormal experience. At least that's what had to happen to me for me to finally change my mind. I was a materialist myself until I experienced things that I couldn't explain. And a reminder here, clairvoyance and/or telepathy was the most common extended perception experience reported by these meditators. 56% saying at least once, 30% saying many times or almost always. And to give some scientific perspective on this, in case you're saying, oh, that's a one-off, for a disease state to be considered rare in the United States, it needs to be affecting 1 in 1,500 Americans to be considered rare. So we've got 30% of meditators reporting these experiences almost always. That translates to 450 out of 1,500 people. I don't think that's rare by anyone's definition. And so once you have that kind of experience, you're no longer questioning if mystical experiences are real. You're asking, why aren't we using all of the tools of the scientific method to investigate this? Where does this information come from? And thankfully, there are many scientists who are using the tools of the scientific method to explore the edges, the frontiers of reality, the leading edge of creation. Reminds me of The Truman Show. For those of you who maybe haven't seen it, it is a world in which a single man has had his entire reality created for him. And he slowly awakens to the fact that this is what's going on. And at the end of the film, he sails out to the horizon. And when he gets to the edge where the sea meets the sky, he realizes it's a wall. And the sky and the clouds are just painted there. So he gets out of his ship and he walks through the door of that wall into an entirely different reality. And there are many scientists who are bravely stepping through that same door. And I am here making this podcast for my 20 subscribers, mostly because I want to be part of it. I want to be part of helping humanity walk through that door into the next version of reality where we understand our own abilities as so much more than what we've been told. And so I hope you'll stick with me. And from my heart to yours, thank you for tuning in to something else entirely.
All right, well, I'm back doing the thing that I do, making edits to make sure the record is correct. Hopefully eventually I'll get good enough that I can stop doing these little outros, but for now I'll just hope that they are charming. So, edit 1. My paper was published in Molecular Cell, not Cell. Still a pretty good journal. I wasn't lying. I just forgot because that was 11 years ago. Probably nobody was going to fact check me, but telling the truth to the best of my ability is important to me. So here we are. Edit 2. I don't want anyone to hear this episode as anti-science. I love and appreciate science, and it has brought us so many wonderful things. Cancer treatments, organ transplants, fMRI machines, and the internet and all of the technology that is allowing you to hear me right now. The issue here is with scientism, okay? So scientism says if something can't be measured, quantified, or experimentally verified, it's irrelevant or unreal. Scientism insists that only objective third person is worthy of measurement, is valid, and that first person perspective is biased or completely illusory. Scientism, like we mentioned, gatekeeps information and sets strict boundaries around what kinds of questions are scientifically valid or worth investigation. It also dismisses synchronicity, or other anomalous experiences as pseudoscience without actually engaging with the data. Science could easily expand, and in fact gradually is expanding, to engage meaningfully with these weird phenomenon, as well as considering first-person subjective experience as worthy of study. And I'm really grateful for my years of scientific training, because as we go down this rabbit hole and take a look at the data that's available about these weird phenomena, I have the scientific chops to critically engage with this, even if we don't understand how they work mechanistically just yet. And I want to say that I do see the irony in what I'm doing here. For years, I would have judged people as new age or woo-woo if they had tried to talk about clairvoyance, telepathy, precognition, etc. as real. And yet here I am trying to use words to persuade the expansion of other scientific minds. But the information just feels too important to not speak about, even if it's forbidden by the Academy. And my last edit is that when I reference the Truman Show and stepping through the door into a new reality, I want to be very clear with how I'm using that metaphor. It isn't a new reality per se, but rather a reality that has always existed, but hundreds of years of materialism, reductionism, and scientism has caused the Western scientific mind to entirely forget this reality. And most scientists actually don't end up getting in their boat and sailing out to the edge by choice. Rather, we become obsessed with knowing more and more and more about this specific fish or this specific type of seaweed, or testing over and over and over how to make the boat sail more efficiently. Many scientists who end up walking through that door weren't trying to get there intentionally. Rather, they had a direct experience with the mystical or paranormal that made them realize both the door and what exists beyond it must be real. And so next time I'll tell some more stories of scientists who had these kinds of experiences that flip them right out of their materialist worldview. And who knows, maybe I'll tell mine too. We'll see how I'm feeling. So until next time, drink water, get sleep, and stay weird, my friends.